Folks, this is Tom Opry, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
Okay, so I'm Peter Cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S. My official pretentious title is Executive Director of a rewilding charity called Scotland The Big Picture.
So what is rewild?
So what is rewilding? Well, I've been wrestling with that question, as have many others, for many, many years. And it's fair to say that definitions do vary. I'll give you our sort of corporate version of it, if you like. That is, rewilding is an evolving process of nature recovery, leading to ecosystem health, function and completeness. But in essence, for me, rewilding is anything that counteracts more de-wilding, anything that joins up and enriches habitats rather than further fragment and degrade them, anything that results in more nature and not less nature.
How do you rewild?
You mean physically? How do you rewild?
What is the process of rewilding as far as physically? What do you do to actually rewild the land?
I think in terms of what we as humans have to do, actually very little. In Scotland, we live in a situation where many of our ecosystems are severely degraded. So there isn't a certain amount of intervention in the short term, but quintessentially rewilding is about letting nature run as it needs to, letting nature plot its own course. Nature is governed by natural processes, and I think in many parts of the world we've either arrested or suppress those processes, and it's about relinquishing control back to nature. And so that's as much a philosophical shift in mindset as it is a physical change to the land and the sea. So it's really about letting nature shape and govern the landscape as it needs to, as it wants to.
So, but it involves planting trees to some extent, right?
So trees is quite interesting. The word trees is quite interesting. At the moment, we have a bit of an obsession with trees. There's a big difference between trees and a woodland ecosystem. And I think, we need to understand that difference. Planting trees per se is not the answer. So it is true to say that Scotland is one of the least wooded countries in Europe. Our tree cover is something like 18%. The average across Europe is about 37%. So trees plays a part in it, but as does heather, blaeberry, wood ants, badgers, otters. All of these species are components in a system, and it's the system, it's the functionality of the system that we as rewilders want to improve. If you draw an analogy with a plane engine or an aeroplane, if a few rivets drop out, the plane will still fly. A few more rivets drop out and it starts to wobble a little bit. Ultimately, if you keep removing components, it's going to come out of the sky. And really, our ecosystems are no different. We've taken away some key components. And I won't say we're falling out of the sky, but we're faltering a wee bit here in Scotland. And we need to make those repairs to get the plane flying functionally again.
So, I've been to some of the JMT properties and some of these properties that they've purchased that are what were sporting estates at one time, and I just see these hills covered in trees that have been planted, and then of course fenced off from the deer and stuff like that. Is that planting? I mean, there is an effort, but with the the rewilding effort, there is an actual effort to plant trees. But is that kind of forcing nature to go in a certain direction? And if it is, explain to me, or if it isn't, kind of why is that?
I think there's an effort to plant trees because we are bereft of woodland ecosystems generally. It is fair to say that we, the conservation stroke rewilding community, is only planting trees when there's no prospect of natural regeneration. And in some cases, the ground is so far away from the nearest tree source, or seed source, should I say, that planting is the only option. But where regeneration is an option, in the Cairns, for example, where there's lots of seed sources, but you have fragmented woodland, then natural regeneration, allowing nature to do it for you, is the best option for sure.
Yeah, we saw quite a bit of that over in Skye, in that area where they've actually there's a seed bed already in the ground. You're getting these regenerative, natural, native forests, mostly deciduous trees, but they're coming back, and it's it's nice to see that because you have such a complex biodiverse habitat, whereas because of the logging schemes here, since the wars and in the 70s and 80s, I see all these monocultures.
Yep.
And it's like, it doesn't seem to me like that's very natural.
No, not at all, and that's definitely not what rewilding will look like 100, 200 years from now. It is this mosaic, this complex mosaic of open glades, boggy woodland, scrub and mature trees, and of course dead and dying wood within those systems. So again, it's that difference between trees, in inverted commas, and a healthy woodland system, and there's a big difference between those two things.
What I guess the question I want to ask you about is about deer. Are deer evil?
Yeah, so the concept of deer being evil, or any animal being evil, is a completely human construct, of course. Deer are not evil. Deer are a necessary and integral part of this landscape. The problem, if indeed you perceive it to be a problem, is the number of deer. So the way that the Scottish landscape has been managed for the last 150, 200 years, generally speaking, to paraphrase, is to maximise the number of deer. There's all sorts of reasons for that. So we have a situation where the grazing pressure, primarily through red deer and sheep, is preventing the regeneration of the woodland habitats, and not only woodland, but habitats in general. And it's keeping them in a suppressed, degraded situation. So certainly nobody I know wants to get rid of deer. I certainly don't. But we need to control the grazing pressure, at least in the short term. And by the short term, I'm talking 30, 40 years. So we can create this mosaic of habitats that is better not only for deer, but also for a range of other species. So the ultimate aim here is to create a greater abundance and diversity of life, including deer.
Okay, great. With the change of one of the things that Balharry talked to me about was that he sees Scotland being purchased up, these sporting estates by very wealthy international landowners, kind of like what Anders Poulsen's done here, and that they have the money to build the tourism infrastructure, that there's going to be an all new economy here that's going to change. So going away from the sporting estates into a more tourism-based economy. How does that really work? I know Nigel says the model hasn't been proven out, but how will that model work, and what will happen to the people that are already here living on the land? The folks that are the keepers and the stalkers and all that stuff.
Yeah, I see the change of land use in Scotland as very much as a social and a cultural process, as well as a physical process. And I think the fear of change, the fear of people's sense of identity, sense of belonging to the land that is inherent with many people, that is very, very real for many people. Change is something that human beings don't necessarily welcome easily. We're not comfortable with it, but change is inevitable. And I think in some cases it's desirable too. So it is true to say that what you might term traditional land uses, and by that I mean sheep farming, grouse shooting, upland deer stalking, etc., they are under pressure, they are under scrutiny, and in some cases they are being phased out. Is that an economic necessity? Is it a reflection of the challenges that we face as a society, climate breakdown, global nature loss being two very obvious ones? Or is it a combination of all of those things? I don't believe, and I see absolutely no evidence for this notion that rewilding automatically leads to depeopling. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And you mentioned Glen Feshie just a few miles from here. If you go up that glen now, there are more people working there than there were 10 years ago. So they're the same stalkers, the same gillies, but there's also fencing contractors, tree planters, peatland restoration experts, scientists, researchers, mountain bike operators. All of these businesses, some of them are tourism related, some of them not, are in some way or other connected with So if you go, for example, up to Glen Feshie, which is just a few miles from here, there are more people living and working in that landscape than there have been for the last 20, 30 years. Still the same deer stalkers, land managers, but you've also got fencing contractors, you've got peatland restoration experts, you've got scientists, researchers, tourism operators, hospitality providers. All of these businesses, in one way or another, are a reflection of the landscape that is in recovery, or rewilding, if you like. So this notion that rewilding will lead to depopulation, I don't accept that. It will involve change, and at an individual level that can be challenging. But equally, some of the skill sets that you describe within the stalking community, for example, they're really, really, really valuable. And again, if you take Glenfeshine as an example, they're still deer stalking, but they're doing other things as well. They're being retrained to diversify their role. So I don't see, I understand the fear, but I don't think there's any serious foundation in it.
So across the valley, Glen over here, we have Kinrara, where Brewdog has purchased it under the auspices of becoming the very first beer company to be carbon neutral. And I've been there. I've seen the excavators, the track hoes digging up the heather land, which I kind of look at, and I know according to the UN that you guys have like 60% of the heather moorland in the world, and it's considered an ecosystem of importance. How do you square with them planting Douglas fir, Sitka spruce after digging up the ground and, you know, breaking through the iron pan on the soils and changing the soil, for thousands of years, and putting non-native trees up there? How does that kind of move into your big scope of thing? Is that good or bad?
I don't know that I'd necessarily want to refer to Brewdog specifically, but you know, it is true to say that there are organisations moving in on the Scottish landscape with an agenda to arguably offset their carbon. Some might say greenwash their public profile. I think, as with anything, there are good examples and there are bad examples. The example you mentioned not too far from here, I would argue, is not a particularly good example. I think their motivations are questionable. But equally, we work with corporate bodies who have no agenda. They don't want greenwash. They just want to give back to nature, and in many cases, give back to local communities as well. So this term green-led, I think, is a typical sort of term adopted by the popular media to generalize a whole range of different organizations coming to this place for different reasons and for different outputs. So I think there are good examples of, you know, corporate rewilders, and there are some questionable examples as well. And I think organisations like Scotland the Big Picture, we have quite a long list of sort of criteria, quite stringent criteria of companies that we will deal with and those that we won't. So we need to make sure that the motivation of these investors is well placed. And it is true to say that in some cases that's not the case.
Great answer. So what I've noticed over the last year of being here and going back and forth talking to this, there's a lot of animosity towards different groups here. It's literally chucking hand grenades at each other. It seems to me, though, you know, I mean, one of the things that when I first, sat down with David Balhard to interview, he pulls out his iPhone and starts scrolling through and showing me all these big stags he's hunted. And I'm like, okay, so why don't you get along with the keepers and the stalkers, you know? And it seems like there's a lot of people want the same things.
Yeah.
How do we bridge those gaps, between these different user groups and their traditions? Because let's face it, I mean, we are a product of our traditions and our experiences. Yep. How do we bridge those gaps so that we can leave this place better than we found it?
It's a really interesting question about how we bridge the gaps, so to speak, or the divides between different interest groups. And I often remark, people say to me, it must be great working in a wild landscape with these sexy wildlife species. And I say, yeah, that must be great. It's not what I do. Most of my time, it's trying to bridge those gaps. I think my job, or our job really, is 20% ecology and 80% psychology. It's all about people. I do believe that we share more common ground than we perhaps than A, we believe ourselves, and B, perhaps as is portrayed in the popular media. The popular media like division and conflict. They like tribalism. They like segregating and compartmentalizing these interest groups. That's not helpful, in my opinion. So I deal with a lot of deer stalkers and land managers and farmers, etc. I've never come across a situation where you can't find some common ground. And I think the secret is building out from that common ground. Let's not spend days, weeks, months and endless energy trying to reconcile our extreme differences over wolves, for example. Let's agree that we all need and want a healthy environment. And then the only question is, what does that look like and how do we get there? So for me, this is as much a social process, a philosophical or a cultural process, as it is a physical one. And I think the answer to your question really is finding that common ground and building out from that. Because what you do then, you build trust and you build a common objectivity. You find shared solutions to the shared challenges that we all face.
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, I look at it and it's like, well, you know, if you need to remove a certain number of deer, why aren't the people from the Scottish Gamekeepers Association providing you that service for benefit to themselves, which benefits you, and everybody wins at the end of the game? But I know that there's these wars about this per square kilometer capacity of deer and that stuff, and it's just, to me, I'm like, guys, I mean, you really don't have a lot of deer here for the most part. There are some places that do,
exactly,
you know, but for the most part, it's pretty well under control from what I can tell.
Yeah, and I think you know, ironically, we've been talking about, we're doing a film about deer at Scotland the Big Picture, and the idea is that ultimately, if we get this mosaic of vibrant, dynamic, healthy habitats in place, and this is not going to happen quickly or easily, but let's project 50, 100 years from now, there's no reason we can't have more deer, actually. It's just the fact we've got an impoverished landscape supporting an impoverished deer herd, and they're all scratting around trying to find food in an environment that doesn't provide a great deal. So there's a welfare issue as well here for me. Others would contradict this. But I think if we can give deer a better home to live in, there's no reason why we can't have more healthy deer and greater numbers. You know, and that's the irony.
Yeah, and speaking of that, especially in this glen here, it seems, I mean, I'm used to seeing in Montana the deer moving unrestricted. You know, they live, you know, these environments have evolved with deer and the impact of them. And of course, elk are woody browsers, and we have lots of those where I live. But I see this insane amount of deer fence. How does that, your idea of having deer have a healthier environment and be able to be a healthier animal, healthier species here, if they're constantly running into fences everywhere here in the Highlands?
Yeah.
I mean, because, I mean, if a deer, deer for 2,000 years, there has only been a, 5% cover of forest on this island in the Highlands.
Yeah.
And now we're at 25%, somewhere in there. Yet I would almost argue, and those deer did fine. I mean, they survived up there, and you know they've adapted to living, you know, over the thousands of years in the Highlands here and up in the moorland, in the heather moorland. But how do we cotton with this fact that deer really don't have access to the habitats they need when they need it?
It's a crazy system, and I think, you know, some of the perspectives that you've alluded to, some of the quite narrow perspectives, are born of that system. And we live in a landscape that is very compartmentalized. You've got blocks of forestry here, blocks of farmland here, the odd pocket of wildness or rewilding dotted in and around. The system, and by the system I don't only mean the financial support system, but also the philosophical cultural system, perpetuates that. And you know, deer fencing is a tool that delineates between one bit of the system and another. But as you rightly say, it's unsightly, it's intrusive, and it prevents the free movement of not only deer, but other animals. I hate fencing, I've got to tell you, I really, really detest it, both physically and ideologically. But again, it is the system. And I think not only are we seeing a change in people's perspectives of what the land should do, which species it should accommodate, and who those species should serve, but we're also starting to see a shift in the policy system that finances land management in Scotland. And that's, you know, the UK, rightly or wrongly, has left Europe. We've now got to come up with a new land management subsidy system, and I believe that will be very, very different to that has persisted since the Second World War, really. And so ultimately it might be economics that forces the change as well as social trends.
We have this effort to plant trees, and plant trees in places that maybe like the heather moorlands, that soils in those ecosystems have evolved pretty much without trees. Is there a human romantic, emotional reason for doing that? I mean, you're trees for life. Why is this about trees? Or at least that's the perception it comes across to the outside public.
Sure.
Why is this? Here comes the dog, by the way.
Oh, right, great.
So, why are trees romanticized here in Scotland?
I don't know that trees are romanticised necessarily. There's a recognition that Scotland once had a much greater tree cover or woodland cover. I don't like the word trees for reasons I've mentioned. And so, part of rewilding is to try and restore that woodland cover, or some of it anyway. But that is not to say that that's at the expense of valuable peatland habitats, for example. And we saw a disastrous situation in the 60s and 70s where deep peat, which we now understand stores more carbon than tropical rainforests, was overplanted with exotic conifers. And again, there was a financial incentive to do so. Hopefully we've learned a lesson from that. So forestry policy in Scotland, for example, now won't allow tree planting on deep peat for that very reason. So I think our ecological knowledge, our ecological awareness is improving. And again, it's not about trees per se, it's about creating this healthy, functional ecosystem, part of which on open moorland or some open moorland would benefit from more vegetation cover, let's call it that, rather than trees per se. And that includes, up on the high hills, the montane woodland that is very, very rare in Scotland, the dwarf birches, the miniature willows that should grow at altitude but don't because of historic grazing pressure. So trees are often picked out as the sort of silver bullet. It's not about trees, it's about fully functioning ecosystems, and trees are just one part of that, as are millions of other species.
Staying kind of in that ecosystem, Balhari says that the management of grouse moors is done to the detriment of the land and the animals that are in it. How would you respond to that?
I think my problem with, I suppose my problem with grouse moors is that it serves the need. The management of a driven grouse moor serves the needs of just a few species and just a few people. So my question is, could that area of land be utilised in a way that benefits a greater range of species and a greater range of people? That's the first question. The second question, I think more philosophically, I guess, is that if grouse shooting had never existed, and in 2023, in a climate emergency and a biodiversity emergency, somebody suggested it as a sustainable land use for the future, it would be laughed at. It would be completely dismissed. And yet here we have roughly 12-15% of Scotland's entire land area devoted to driven grouse shooting. So it's not anti-grouse shooting as such. It's a question of, does this land use benefit society at large in the 21st century? That's the question.
Should it be benefiting society? I mean, is that the whole purpose of people don't live up on these highlands. I guess could you explain why it should benefit society and how it does?
Well, we
want everything to be natural, right?
I don't think it's necessarily, again, depends how you define natural, of course. Basically what you've got with grouse moors is huge areas of land intensively managed to produce effectively one species, red grouse. Now there are other beneficiaries, wading birds would be one, there are other specialist species associated with heather moorland, but it's a fairly narrow group of species. At a social level, I would argue that grouse moors don't support as many people as an alternative land use could. So at a social and a cultural level, or social and economic level, that land could be more productive.
I've seen some research and I've talked to some scientists that have they've researched grouse moors that have gone, that are no longer managed as grouse moors. And the science says that within 10 years, they lose 50% of their biodiversity. And then it's peer-reviewed science. I mean, it's real. So how but it is. I mean, and David says, "Well, I don't believe it." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know." I mean, every time I see a peer-reviewed paper, I mean, I guess you could make up the information, but usually, if you're a scientist, I mean, it's like being a doctor, right? You have a ethical, objective here to be objective, to be scientific, to let science figure out what's going on. What happens if we all know that in the United States, like we have wild quail there, and in southeast United States, they do low intensity burning and they do suppression of ground predators, and we give those landowners awards in the United States. Here, you guys want to hang them from the highest hill. How do you, if science says you do lose biodiversity by not managing, and it makes sense too, right? I mean, you're creating a lot of different levels of habitat, and as we know in the United States, especially for deer and turkey and things like that, the more variety of edge cover you have, and those are edge cover animals there in North America. But how do you kind of cotton to that science, and do you believe it? Do you not believe it? I mean, what's your thoughts on it?
I think as a society, and within society, there are tribes, if you like. Everybody belongs to a tribe, and I think we have a tendency to cherry pick science, cherry pick evidence that supports our particular agenda, that frames our objectives in a favourable light. And I see that all the time. And don't get me wrong, rewilders do it every bit as much as other sectors do it. So I'm not disputing the veracity of the science. I would say that it's probably come from a sort of an internal commission in some cases. So there's a predisposition to come out with a certain result. And again, I would emphasise that applies across all sectors, not just the supporters of Heather Moreland. I suppose at the end of the day, the tension between rewilding, pro-rewilders and anti-rewilders possibly lies with the belief system that on the one hand says humans have an obligation, a moral duty even, to manage the landscape, and those that take an ecocentric view, which is that nature should have free reign. And it's that word control that sits in the middle of that. How much, to what extent, and whether humans should control the landscape to their own ends, and over what sort of area, and what are those ends. So I think there are two words at the heart of this tension, this debate, call it what you will. One is change and the fear of change and who is advocating that change. And the second one is this business of control. And we live in a country where for hundreds, if not thousands of years, we've had control over every square inch of it and every species within it. And we've made it work for just one species, us. So coming along and suggesting that we should cede control to another species or another set of species, that's really unsettling for a lot of people. So this business, this interface between how much, whether and to what extent humans should manage the landscape, I think is as at the core of the rewilding debate. Some people would say it has to serve humans, and some people would say, we're just one species among many, and we need to understand our place in the natural order. And I think that's where the rub comes, and it's a difficult and often fractious rub.
One of the things that we push is the fact, I said earlier, there's 8 billion humans as of last year now on the planet. The push and the stress on our ecosystems and resources is like never, the Earth has never seen anything like this in human time.
Yeah.
But to say, let's let nature figure it out, yet we know that there's going to be forces that are going to put their, they're going to want to control things. And obviously, as we've said, for thousands, as long as humans have existed, we've terraformed the Earth for our survival.
Yeah.
Is nature really going to take care of this on its own? That's also going to benefit the 8 billion humans? Or, are humans going to have to be involved in that management? Because, you guys are planting trees.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you are making conscious decisions about physically what's going to happen on the ground.
Yeah.
And, of course, you got two different user groups. One, it's trying to, traditional sporting people that, they want to have certain things with the wildlife. And you want to kind of let nature just do its own thing.
Yeah.
How do we cotton with the fact that, with 8 billion humans, can we really allow nature to run the show here?
Yeah,
I mean, it does run the show. I mean, I
Sure,
get it.
of
I mean,
course.
but the reality is we're gonna fuck it up
Yeah.
if we're not careful.
Yeah. No, it's a completely valid question, and all of these factors, not least of which the burgeoning human population, play a massive role in all of this, of course. And that's not unique to Scotland, by the way. That's a global challenge. How do we feed and service a growing population against the backdrop of a climate and biodiversity crisis? That's not an easy answer an easy question to answer. What I would say is that, you know, for the likes of Scotland, the big picture, we're not suggesting that rewilding should take over, that it should be everywhere. We're pragmatic people. We understand that people live and work in this landscape, and those people need to be fed. It's a question of, could we do more? Could we do better? And that applies not only to big areas in the Scottish Highlands, it applies to green infrastructure in our cities. It applies to the margins around farms. Could we have more nature in our landscape, whether that's a big estate like Glenfeshie or a garden in the middle of Edinburgh? And I think the answer to that is yes. Now, whether you call that rewilding, whether you call it ecological restoration, nature recovery, call it what you like, the net result is more nature and a more functioning nature, or nature machine, so to speak. So it's not a question of wiping the slate clean and starting again and trying to create some sort of Disney-fied version of the past. That's not what it's about. It's a recognition of the challenges we face and how we're going to best address those challenges against the backdrop of those really huge challenges. And human population is really the elephant in the room with all of this. And again, that's a global challenge, of course. So no silver bullet, no easy answer, but from my point of view, so let me just come at it another one, just give you a little. One way of looking at rewilding is that it's a journey, it's a scale. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that scale is 1 to 10. Let's say Montana is at 7. Let's say Scotland is at 4, just arbitrarily. My job, our job as rewilders, is to get us from 4 to 5. We probably will never get to 10 because we live in a tiny, relatively crowded island. Can we get to 7? Can we get to 8? Possibly in the future. But my immediate job, my immediate priority is to get us from where we are and just inches along that scale of wildness, just that little bit. And that needs the likes of the farmers and the keepers and the land managers to come with us on that journey. So our job is a challenge because on the one hand, we're constantly trying to push the envelope to move us along that scale. But of course, we can't alienate, neither would we want to, alienate the very people that we need to bring with us. And that's a wafer thin line, given all the social and cultural sensitivities that you've referred to.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And one of the things that's kind of bugged me here, a couple of things, as we've gone and done the research here. My associate producer on this is a photographer named Tony Bynum, and Tony's got a master's in land management in the United States, works for the Department of Interior. He's a card-carrying Native American,
Right.
And so he has a very unique perspective. And we've really just pounded our heads like, well, why is this and why is that? We see this effort to take grouse moors, and it's not just even grouse moors, it's just that heather ecosystem, and plant trees on it, and then we look at this agricultural lands that we have down lower that in some cases are fairly marginal agricultural lands that actually we know agricultural lands is the demise of biodiversity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these are monocultures
Sure.
for the most part, are very limited is when it comes to biodiversity. Why aren't efforts by groups like yours and the rewilding effort targeting these marginal farmlands and grasslands to be able to make them more biodiverse and more healthy?
Again, I don't think rewilding is targeting, as you put it, a given habitat or a given land use. I think there are some extremes. You might argue that driven grouse moors are one such extreme, where the intensity of the management in some cases is undoubtedly detrimental. Maybe not to red grouse, but to a whole range of other species. And there's routine culling of stoats, weasels, foxes, corvids on those estates. But it's not about targeting grouse moors as such. It's about how can we identify across the whole country. Grouse moors might be one example, upland deer estates might be another, a garden in Edinburgh might be another, marginal farmland might be another. How can we identify those opportunities to create more nature without displacing the people that live there and work there, and not only not displacing them, but also creating additional benefits for them. One of the challenges in Scotland or in rural places really across Europe is depopulation, especially young people leaving rural areas to go and work in the city. It's completely understandable. Those communities will ultimately die, like a forest would if there's no young trees growing up in it. So that's a social challenge that we have to address. We believe that rewilding, it's not a silver bullet. We've never made any claims about it being a silver bullet, but it does bring benefit. If we get it right, it brings benefits for nature, it brings benefits for climate, but crucially, it also brings benefits for people. So yeah, I think that it's not a question of targeting something and banning it and stopping it. The question is, could it be done differently to benefit a wider range, to create a wider range of beneficial outcomes?
Now, you used the word detrimental, the management of grouse moors. I mean, how is it exactly detrimental, and what animals are actually being negatively harmed by that form of management?
You would ask any grouse moor manager, is grouse shooting in its historical context possible without severe persecution of the species that impact on grouse? And that's predators and scavengers generally. And I think if they were honest, most of them would answer no. So the detriment, as you call it, is to those species that are literally eliminated to allow red grouse to produce a harvest for the shooters.
But detriment was your word, not mine.
Okay.
So, yeah, I was like,
well,
that's why I asked you. You said, David said the same thing, and I said, okay, so just explain it to me.
If you're a crow or a fox or a stoat or a weasel, it's detrimental because you have your head blown off.
So I talked to Andy Whiteman too, and about raptor persecution and whatnot. And we know there's been a long history of raptor persecution for the grouse moors. Obviously, their idea there is to limit, just like the ground predators we're talking about here. But of course, the laws have changed, society's changed, and killing avian predators literally can land you in jail, including the landowner.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure that these guys, especially if they're wealthy people, don't really want to go to jail. I understand that the management of those grouse moors, I mean, I've been on Glen Ogle, I've been on some of the Dunnock estates, and I mean, I have seen large variety of avian predators, and both species and numbers. And when I talked to Andy about it, he says, well, yeah, Tom, that's because these are all animals that are coming in to an area that's devoid of predators because the guys killed them all. Well, that's not really how nature works. I mean, yeah, they do come in and fill these vacuums where there is, but they're coming there because the habitat it's easy to hunt on, and there's a whole bunch of walking McDonald's around. I mean, let's face it, if I put 100 Big Macs out on the table and school got out and I just said, hey, kids, there's Big Macs out there, guess what? 500 kids would be standing there by the table pulling Big Macs out. So is there really raptor persecution going on, on a regular basis on all these estates? Or is this kind of a fallacy that's more of cherry picking something to be able to throw rocks at a different user group?
Yes, I think the issue of raptor persecution, as with all of these issues, is complex and it is contested. You asked me the question: is raptor persecution going on? Yes, unequivocally. There's evidence on a regular basis that is it going on. Is it going on all estates? No, absolutely not. And there is a tendency, we all have a tendency to generalize and to use a broad brush. Grouse moors are good, grouse moors are bad, rewilders are good, rewilders are bad. There's a huge amount of nuance and layering across all of this. So raptor persecution, in my opinion, is a huge and embarrassing stain on Scotland as a country and as a society. In a progressive, modern country, it shouldn't be happening. And it does happen. Is it as widespread as it once was? I believe not. I believe the ability for us to monitor that is better because of things like satellite tracking. Equally, those perpetrators that are doing it know that and have, it's a bit like drugs. Every time the police come up with a way of curtailing the trade, the dealers come up with a way of bypassing it. It is a problem. There's no doubt about that. And I think if you just turn the tables a little bit, if you're in the shooting community or the grouse shooting community, it's a problem for you. It's a problem for the reputation of the shooting community. My frustration is that shooting community is not as willing, if you like, to come out and expose those bad apples, if you like, in the bunch, as they should do. And I believe if they did, we talked earlier about building bridges and building trust. That would be a bridge that could be built. So there is a problem at the moment, both physically in terms of the persecution itself, but also the sort of cover of the cover that some parts of the shooting community provide for the perpetrators. But again, I would just stress that's a broad brush, and there's a huge range of nuance in all of that.
So there are some landowners that are willing to let their keepers take some big chances here. It's kind of a little game of Russian roulette, to be exact.
Well, I think there are some landowners that tell their keepers not to do it, and they do it. There are landowners that turn a blind eye. There are landowners that actively instruct their keepers to do it, so the keeper becomes a victim of the system, as it were. And there's everything in between. And there's landowners and keepers that will have none of it. And everything in between. So it's wrong to say that all grouse moors are shooting raptors or killing whatever it happens to be. That is not the case. It is the case to say, though, that in order to run a sustainable moor, there has to be some predator control. Now the question is, to what degree is that control? And at a, if you just put aside the legislation a moment, is it any more appropriate or moral to shoot a stoat or to shoot a golden eagle? Golden eagle is illegal to shoot, and society rightly recoils in horror, but stoats are somehow dispensable. So yeah, at the end of the day, a moor is run according to certain management principles, and some people find those palatable and acceptable, and others less so.
Yeah. And talking, just FYI, to Peter Fraser, we did a couple interviews with him, and you mentioned something. There's about 300 to 400 grouse moors in Scotland here, and his estimate is it's 3 or 4 outfits that are doing the wrong thing. And as a matter of fact, that's what he's telling me. And he's like, and he has no reason to lie to me. I mean, because I'm considered to be friendly too, right? So it's like, okay. And so again, it's kind of like I said at the beginning of the question. It feels like there's a big, and you used the term broad brush that's painted on here, and it's. And in the United States, I mean, it's absolutely, you can't go kill bald eagles. You can't kill hawks and stuff. Does one happen every once in a while? Usually it's some kids out dicking around with a shotgun and shoot something. It's very rare that people that are maintaining, like I said earlier, our quail plantations and wild quail. I mean, when you take wild quail and you manage them just like you do the grouse moors in the southeast United States, you have really good populations. Well, it makes sense, right? Because you're inhibiting the ground predators and you're enhancing the land for them, their food and cover. But when you get off those lands, the wild quail populations are almost gone.
Yeah, sure.
Because humans, that's one thing, our ecosystems have evolved over fire. Now that's not the case here because it's so wet, but that's one of the things that we look at it and say, like, wait a minute, without humans burning the land, which is long before Indo-European northern white settlers showed up. And so these ecosystems, they evolve with fire, and without that, then those species that we hold near and dear aren't going to do very well. It's kind of like the whole that stop firefighters with the bear there. It's like all of a sudden we realized that we had all this loading of fuels in the forest because they weren't ever burning for 80 or 100 years, and when they did burn, it literally scarified the ground 3 or 4 feet down and killed the seabeds and everything else, and that's not a good thing. And so and if you were at Yellowstone, you saw that in '88, and after they had another big fire after that, and so. Yeah, we kind of need to have fire because that's what that ecosystem here. But here, do you guys have? I mean, I've heard about some catastrophic fires up in the Glen. I'm not glens per se, but up in the heather moorland when you've got some really rank heather and you got a fairly amount of it dries out and it creates a fuel load. And so there's been some big fires. How do you guys manage fires? I'm just curious on a side note.
Yeah, I mean, I think the subject of wildfires is in there with the debate around rewilding and land use generally. And again, I think it's a good example of how different people cherry pick the evidence to support their particular objective. I hear a lot of rhetoric about muir burn, which is the deliberate burning of heather, predominantly to sustain grouse, being damaging to the climate. It emits carbon, and that makes sense. Equally, I hear the argument that you've just alluded to, whereby rank heather is a fuel load, and therefore the heather has to be burnt regularly to prevent that fuel load building. So yeah, I think it's another chess piece, if you like, on the bigger board that is moved around according to your particular agenda.
Okay, that's great. Kind of, you guys have started your organization 2018, the Scotland Big Picture. You guys are obviously doing things that you feel are important to affect change on the landscape. Where do you see the Highlands of Scotland and the islands in 5, 10, 50 years from now? I mean, really based on what you're seeing. I know what you want to see, but based on all these different conflicting forces and different user groups and land use issues, where do you really think it's going to be? And then maybe just add where you hope it.
Yeah, I think the direction of travel for the future is really interesting, actually. And the direction of travel over the last 4 or 5 years has been very much towards, within the conservation community, it's been very much towards ecosystem restoration rather than the individual species management. That's been a fundamental change, and that's really accelerating. In the farming community, there is a recognition that farmers have to play a role in climate mitigation and biodiversity loss. In the uplands, again, depends on who you speak to, but if you take deer management, for example, which plays a big role in upland management, there is a recognition more recently about deer numbers and the need to regulate them. That has been a relatively recent development, and it goes back to what I said earlier about finding common ground. We're starting to get better at finding common ground. So building from that common ground, it is likely that over the next 5, 10 years, there will be more ecosystem restoration. Call it that. You don't have to call it rewilding. At what speed and at what scale and to what end point that develops, I don't know. But I see the direction of travel as a positive one. The caveat to that is that we must ensure, as that journey rolls out, that people are part of that journey. And so again, this has never been about de-peopling or replacing people with nature. This is about, we all face challenges. They're existential challenges, some of these things. How are we going to address them as a society, as a country, as a species even? So these are big challenges, but I see change, I see positive change, and ultimately I would hope that we end up in a place, going back to my definition of rewilding really, where we have ecosystems that are healthy, they are functional, and wherever possible they are complete, with a range of species that help shape and can help shape in the future those ecosystems. So that's where I hope we'll get to. I'll be dead by the time all of that happens, but that's the journey that we're on.
Great. Down in Edinburgh, that's where your government is. It dictates a lot of the policies on land use issues. And of course, you alluded to rules and regulations and licensing and all that stuff. Do you really feel that the Scottish National Party and the government in Edinburgh today, and over the last 10, 12, whatever years that they've been in power, do they really care about the land and the people that live on the land? Or is more of their emphasis on the people between Glasgow and Edinburgh?
Yeah, I think the political winds blow in a quite fickle way. I think we've all seen across the world how quickly those winds change in the last 10 years or so. We've had Brexit, you've had Trump, we've all had our challenges to deal with. And Scotland is no different. So was ecological recovery high on the government's list of priorities 10 years ago? No. 5 years ago, starting to creep in on the edges as Scotland declared a climate emergency, as one of the first countries to do so. Now, and again, this is as much about the personnel in the government at the moment, right now, there's a huge momentum behind it. but it is fickle, and all of that could change on Monday morning. So from a rewilder's point of view, we're trying to take advantage of the window of opportunity that exists right now, but that window could close in an instant. So it's difficult to predict the political climate moving forward because I think it's just so volatile.
So I'm hearing talk, and obviously there's efforts afoot within the government to like license grouse more, licensing muir burn, these deer policies, things like that, and creating licensing and overview by the government. Is there a comparable opportunity to license rewilding and the people, because you're affecting change, similar? I mean, it just, I'm trying to figure out, is the government trying to manage these ecosystems for the benefit of all, or is this just being kind of cherry picked of, this licensing schemes? Is that more along the lines of, we're doing these things because we don't like what these people are doing, but we like what you're doing, so you're not getting licensed?
Yes, I think that's
what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think it's a very astute question. I think that grouse moors and muir burn and arguably predator persecution is licensed or is becoming licensed to reflect wider societal attitudes. Nobody likes regulation, and there's a pushback against that licensing because of that reason. It's that perception that the establishment is imposing its will on rural communities. I would contest that rewilding isn't licensed. It absolutely is. You can't just go and plant trees wherever you like. You can't just go and re-wiggle or re-meander a river wherever you like. There are regulatory consents that you do need. And also the subsidy system has to be worked if indeed that's the route that you go down. So, rewilding is not a free-for-all, absolutely not. Land use change in Scotland is regulated to varying degrees. And I would say that some elements of sport shooting, for example, and I'm referring maybe to the release of non-native pheasants and red-legged partridges, that's a really good example of an unregulated land use. So again, the perception is that at the moment grouse shooting is under the cosh and it's being overly regulated, and there's pushback from that. But it's no different really in many ways to other land uses in Scotland that are equally regulated. So I wouldn't say it's a level playing field, but it's probably more level than the popular media would have us believe.
Okay, well that was great. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think they're really in searching questions. They're all valid, and clearly there is no black and white answer to any of it. It's a journey, and we're all on it to varying degrees.
This is kind of a filmmaking, maybe 50% investigative journalism.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's good.
Why are people doing what they're doing?
Yeah.
Why is the decisions that are being made the way they are? And at the end, what is the end result? I mean, what are we going to achieve here?
Yeah.
Because like I said, with all the people on the land, it's got to have a benefit to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it has to be a measurable benefit. Yeah. I do have one question too about just economics. From what I can tell, grouse moors don't make any money.
No.
Deer stalking estates don't make any money.
No.
Rewilded estates don't make any money. At this point in time, they don't make any money.
Yep.
What they all have in common is they have passionate landowners that are willing to subsidize the cost to reach the goals that they want to attain. How can these estates, I mean, it's all government subsidized for the most part. I mean, even the farms.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you literally have a artificial economic environment over the entire Highlands.
Yeah.
How does that's not sustainable. Like you said, on Monday, the government could change.
Yeah.
And they could say, well, guess what? We're not paying for this. We're not paying for that. Or you get somebody, environment ministers, well, I don't like planting whatever trees, or it can change.
Yep.
How do we cotton with this fact that none of these estates make money?
So the question of how rewilding pays is something that's put to me quite regularly. But equally, more broadly, how does land management in Scotland pay? How does it become economically viable without support from either public support or other forms. In the case of rewilding, it tends to be either public support or philanthropic support. And this is where, again, we talked about earlier, this at the moment we have a situation where nature recovery, I can only speak about nature recovery in this instance, but nature recovery has a deficit of something like 15 to 20 billion over the next 20 years. That's the difference between the money that's available and the money that's needed. Somebody has to fill that gap. And this is where you've got public-private sector interest coming in. Now, notwithstanding the conversation we had about the motivations of the private sector, at a pragmatic level, without that money, ecosystem restoration is not going to take place. But beyond that, who pays for a healthy environment? Who pays to stop or prevent or disincentivize the farmer from ripping up a forest or filling in a peat bog or whatever? And I would argue that those habitats, those systems are benefiting the whole of society, and therefore the whole of society has to contribute to the maintenance of those systems or the preservation of those systems. And that includes the business sector. So, we face a dilemma at Scotland Big Picture because there's a school of thought that says, don't prostitute your values and jump into bed with the private sector. They're just red-blooded capitalists. And I get that, but equally, if they're not going to pay, who is going to pay? So going back to your question about who pays and how does it become economically viable, we need to develop a sustainable economy that isn't reliant on public subsidy, number one. That's not easy or quick, but that involves also external investment from the private sector. And if we can get to a situation where we have the private sector fueling nature recovery, but what gets spat out at the other end is community benefit, and that might be money, it might be jobs, it might be recreational opportunities, it might be ecosystem services. If we can get that conveyor belt flowing more freely, then I think we've got maybe not a perfect situation, but a situation that's moving towards rewilding and nature recovery becoming an economically viable land use. We're not there yet, but that is the direction of travel.
That's great. We talked about trying to bridge the gaps and stuff, but kind of trying to wrap this thing up. Do you see an opportunity or a time where the sporting estates and the people that work within them and that those folks and the folks that do what you guys do can figure out, you see them living together and assisting each other for the same goals?
I already see that collaboration happening. I do see a dismantling of the tribal barriers that perhaps undoubtedly have hindered progress. You said earlier on, we can all sit in our ivory tower hurling grenades at each other. And if sorry, do you want me to do that again? No, we can all sit in our ivory towers hurling grenades at each other. And if I thought that worked, I'd be on the front row doing it. If I thought shouting at people changed their behavior, then I'd be doing it. But it doesn't work. We all know it doesn't work. So we have to find a way of collaborating. And that has to take into account a recognition of different people's motivations, objectives, agendas, peer group pressures. All of those factors play into this. I do believe the conversation around rewilding or land use change is evolving quite quickly. It's maturing, it's more respectful, it's more progressive, it's more future oriented, it's more solutions focused than ever it has been. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but we are moving in that direction. So yeah, I'm really optimistic about finding that common ground and building from it, and people being at least more respectful of what might have been previously opposing tribes than was the case initially. So I think the answer is yes, and arguably the answer is it has to be, because if it isn't, we're all screwed. And we've got to get past these petty political and cultural barriers that are standing in the way of restoring the living systems that we all depend upon. That's not a rewilder saying that. That's a human being, a citizen of the planet saying that. So yeah, we've got to get beyond self-interest and look at this from a global perspective, if not a Anyway, fuck that last.
No,
you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I got it. Unless you want to try, I think you got it. And I think we have. You've said it a couple different ways.
Yeah.
So I think
okay.
you're good.
Okay.
This has been great. Oh, great interview. So
Well,
you've never done this before, I can tell.
Well, yeah, but those questions are really searching, and it's difficult because, of course, somebody like me, it doesn't have to be me, but you would expect me to have the answers, but there are no answers to any of these. There's my view, there's my perspective, there's my insight, but there's no definitive blueprint that you say, I'll tell you what, this is what we need to do.
And I ask the same hard questions to the other sides,
Yeah,
the other different groups and stuff. And Bell Harry, sometimes he's a little hard on the other side.
Yeah.
He's actually used the word surf with me.
Yeah,
and I'm like, David, that's not the way to go.
No.
I mean,
and John Muir Trust, you'll have picked up, if there is at the moment, if there is a sort of a microcosm of all of this tribal warfare that we've been alluding to, it's between the John Muir Trust and the Assynt Crofters with the deer situation. I get it on both sides. I think I understand. I mean, I know Mike Daniels quite well. There comes a point, I think, with some people where the winning of the war becomes more important than the subject matter that the war started on, and I've seen that in grouse shooting. The one-upmanship becomes the goal rather than saving hen harriers or deer or whatever it happens to be. And when that becomes, when a battle becomes that consuming, you need to get out of it. You need to take a step back, because all you're doing is just digging the hole deeper and deeper and deeper and disappearing down it. And it's hard, I get it. When you've got passionate people that believe in a set of principles, it's hard, but you've got to see the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I've sat down with David, and I was just like, David, I mean, I get it, but I've flown my drone all around Kunag. I said, where are all the trees?
Yeah.
He said, well, the deer ate them all.
Yeah, I know.
I'm like, David, I mean, just don't play me stupid here, all right?
Yeah.
And it's like, and I'm like, how many deer did you kill? And he's like, well, his name's on the permit.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, it was less than 150. I said, do you know how many you shot? Just tell, I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah,
I mean, I was there when it was happening. I got
yeah.
the Crofters Trust invited me to come up. So Tony and I went up, and we were out there with a couple of the Crofters, and and then I ran into Craig Ross, who was the Vesty estate as the keeper there, and he tells me this story about being on a Zoom call with Mr. Vesty and him and David. And David's like, you better feed all the damn deer you can to get them off Kunag, because if we see one on there, I'm going to kill the fucking things.
Yeah.
I asked David, I said, why did you say that?
Yeah.
And I shook him. I was like, everybody's talking to me, David. I mean, at the end, how is this? And you can be the greatest force to work with these people and vice versa, because you all want the same thing. And of course, when I talk to some of these keeper types, they absolutely hate him.
Sure.
And I'm like, guys, and that's when I tell them, he's a hunter.
Yeah.
You guys are hunters. Yeah. Why can't we find the common ground here? Because this can be a win-win.
Yeah, I agree. I agree altogether. And again, these things are often fickle. And if I've got nothing against David Balharry, but if you go back, his predecessor, he would never, ever have said anything like that. Much more of a politician, much more of a pragmatist, which in itself has its frustrations. Some would argue, pace change is only glacial under that. Somehow in the middle there, I think there's a line, and the line is, you need to know what you stand for, you need to know what your principles are, and you need to have the evidence to back them up. But you've got to frame that in a way that recognises that other people equally have their principles and their red lines. You might not like them, you might not agree with them, but they're not invalid, and through their eyes, they're equally as valid as yours. If you don't accept that, then it becomes a war. And of course, we have social media now, which it's just like pouring petrol on the fire. And it drives me nuts seeing some of this stuff on social media. It's so lazy, it's so generalized, it's so ill-informed. You lose all that nuance, all that layering, and it just creates this binary, right and wrong, us against them. Are you one of our tribe or are you against us? We've got to get cannier than that. We really have, because if we don't, it'll just carry on. It'll just carry on. And there's this notion that shouting louder is gonna make the change. If only we could all shout. It doesn't. So yeah, I'm a bit disappointed in Mike and David. I understand why. I understand where they're coming from, but I just want to grab them both. So just whoa, just come out here a minute. Look at these other people in this space. Look what they're saying. Look what the damage you're doing to the reputation of the John Muir Trust. Okay, your followers are, But wider society is probably thinking, "Oh, hang on, guys, come on, really?"
Well, I mean, my audience is America.
Yeah.
You know, this film will be broadcast on American Public Broadcasting. I mean, his biggest donor base is the United States.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, the optics just don't look good.
No, exactly.
You know,
exactly.
and there's no, I mean, why is the CEO of this major charity on the coal list?
Yeah,
Now,
I know.
Dave loves to hunt. I know that.
Yeah.
You know, so one other thing just came to mind. There has been some talk by farmers about the reintroduction of lynx,
Yeah.
of brown bears, Eurasian brown bears potentially, and wolves. You
Yeah.
know, wolves being the big one.
Yeah.
What is the reality of that, and is that something that the rewilding movement is aspiring to? I mean, I know there are individual people out there that are really working hard for those types of species to be back on the landscape. Just kind of recap, you could, just the story about what does it mean and what really is reality there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world in terms of the number of species that we have lost in history, and putting back together that assemblage of species is part of rewilding. But it's not all about wolves. You know, rewilding has been, in the popular media, has become synonymous with wolves in and farmers out and all these lurid headlines. So the reality is right now that bears are not even talked about. Wolves are talked about in a sort of an ideological framework, but yeah, you know, the people in the game with the skin in the game are not even talking about wolves. Lynx is a real possibility. Lynx is a much more, and I think, again, what we need to avoid is conflating all of these species together as large predators. You know, bears and wolves and lynx are very, very different animals. So lynx could make a living in this landscape tomorrow, no problems, plenty of food, plenty of habitat. It's people that are the barrier. So, you know, again, whether it's expanding woodland, restoring peatland, or reintroducing lynx, it's people that will make those decisions. And so the people behind lynx, and we're one of them, you know, they need to win hearts and minds. They need to make the case for lynx ecologically, socially, and arguably also economically. So lynx is a work in progress. I wouldn't say it's imminent, but it's certainly a serious conversation. But wolves and bears, I wouldn't say not in my lifetime, but I'd have to live probably to a good old age to see any progress on any other large predator species.
So just on the last one, what do you think about these wild boar, feral swine that are on this thing? Nigel has them on his property.
Yeah.
And when I asked, now I saw the rooting on the hill, and I'm like, Nigel, what's up with this? You know, and he's like, oh, you know, we're going to have driven wild boar hunts here. And I said, do you understand the economic damage to agriculture that wild, and they're just a huge ecological disaster on the landscape in the United States? It's $2 billion worth of environmental damage every year that occurs on farmland and forest lands because of these pigs. What is your thought on that? Because he's the chairman of your organization, and he's got pom-poms, you know, he's cheering.
Well, I think, again, there's a word that you've used a couple of times there that I'm always nervous about, and that's the word damage. So you could argue that wild boar impact on farmland, or indeed beaver impact on farmland, could be construed as damage. It's a challenge to the economic output of that particular land. But in an area like this, for example, I would argue that beavers or wild boar, they're not going to do damage, they're just going to exert change. And so we shouldn't mistake change, we shouldn't interplay, we shouldn't exchange, start that again. What's the word? We shouldn't confuse, that's the word I'm looking for, okay. So interestingly, you use the word damage, and I think if you're talking about the impact of boar, or indeed a species like beaver on agricultural land, productive land, then damage would be probably an appropriate term. But in an area like this, I would argue that those two species are not exerting damage, they're exerting change, and we shouldn't confuse those two things. So from an ecological point of view, beavers give huge bang for buck. And an ecological point of view, boar give huge bang for buck. Does it jar with us visually, the fallen trees or uprooted heather or whatever it happens to be? Of course it does, because again, we're used to tidiness and orderliness and us having control, and these animals challenge that control. So boar have a role here. Ecologically speaking, they're a really, really productive animal, but they come with baggage, as does any species. The question is, can we live alongside that baggage, or can we mitigate against it? For me, in Scotland, wild boar should be effectively the same as red deer. They should be recognised as a native species. They could provide a sustainable, healthy source of food, as does venison. But at the moment, we've got this mixture of boar and hybrid pigs, and the government just seems to be putting its fingers in its ears and hoping it'll all go away. Meanwhile, they're spreading and, in some cases, pissing people off. So yeah, we've got to get to grips with boar and decide what we want them to do, how we want to perceive them, and how we're going to manage them.
Are these boars dangerous?
Well,
I'm told they're from Eastern Europe.
Nobody. The reality is nobody really knows. I suspect there's a mixture of purebred wild boar, and in some cases they're hybridized with feral pigs. So in any population of wild boar, you're probably going to have varying degrees of hybridization. But again, it could be argued that genetic purity is one thing, but their ecological impact on the landscape is pretty much the same, whether it's a pig or a boar or whatever. So no, forget that bit, that's bollocks. Leave it at that.
Okay.
Well, Peter, this has been an excellent, just an absolutely great interview, and one of the better ones I've done in the time I've spent here in Scotland. I really hope that all these disparate sides can come together for the greater good of not only Scotland, but our whole planet.
And the answer in Scotland, across all of those people that you've spoken to, is no. That none of them want to leave that legacy.
Yeah, they're all basically saying the same thing.
Exactly, and that's the frustrating thing. It is, going back to your question, it is bridgeable, but it has all of that baggage, and as you rightly say, that baggage is entrenched from way back. And if you said to me right now, if I could give you one thing, what would it be? I'd say a Scottish accent. Because what that would do is authenticise my voice in the eyes of Peter Fraser, Craig Ross, etc. Because at the moment, and it's a generalisation, but at the moment, there is an element of, what's this guy with an English accent doing, telling us what to do? Now, that's not the way I feel about it, and I'm not telling anybody what to do. I don't think I'm that stupid or arrogant. But the perception is that, I'm one of the establishment. I'm one of the very people that they're rallying against. I'm one of those civil servants in the city halls with the ranchers telling the wolves are a good idea. It's all of that sort of stuff. So you've got all of that historical baggage percolating to the surface in all of this stuff, whether it's deer, beavers, trees, heather moorland, grouse, whatever. And it all does, the word bias or prejudice is the word, because it prejudices people's perspectives from the very beginning. Just going very quickly to one thing you said about collaboration. There's an initiative going on at the moment called Finding the Common Ground, ironically, and it's been commissioned by Scottish Environment Link, which is a sort of coalition of all the environmental groups in Scotland, and the Association of Deer Management Groups, which, as you know, they manage deer populations in Scotland. But interestingly, it's being facilitated. So, it's ironic that Dave Balharry said to you, could you come along as a filmmaker? You think, with all due respect, you're not the person, yes, you're impartial, but you need a social science facilitator. You need somebody that understands people to play that role. And what this Finding the Common Ground has done has found that. So there's a facilitator in Edinburgh doing it. They know nothing about red deer. They don't need to. They know about people. And I went along just as an observer, really, to one of the events. There was about 70 people there. There was folk from Vestey's Ground. There was, loads of stalkers, land managers, conservationists. Mike Daniels was there. And what they did very cleverly, but very simply, is just stripped away the badge, the uniform. Yeah. So people were there in tweeds or Gore-Tex, but actually they were not physically stripped away, but metaphorically. And the atmosphere in the room changed completely. And I thought they handled the whole thing really, really interestingly, and started off, okay, what do we all agree on? That we all know what we don't agree on, but what do we agree on? And then they built out from that. And it's just basic social science, but we've been shit at doing that. So whether it's beavers or trees or rewilding or deer management or whatever, I think that sort of social, people-focused approach is the way forward, and not trying to cherry pick this evidence and shovel it down people's throats in the hope that they'll swallow it and change. It just doesn't work that way. I wish it did, but it doesn't. Anyway, yeah, so it is interesting that the process of starting to understand the motivations behind some of these perspectives is starting to roll out, finally. Anyway.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's been a great discussion, very thought-provoking, and I hope that the folks that not only watched The Last Keeper, the film that we've got coming out, will learn more about the issues here in Scotland, and hopefully the folks of Scotland, especially the urban folks, will have an opportunity to kind of see what the realities are on the ground, so that we can start to make decisions as a society that make more common sense. Thanks, Peter. And folks, thanks for listening to the Shepherds of the Wild podcast, brought to you by the Shepherds of Wildlife Society, available on all places where great podcasts live. Please sign up to our newsletter at shepherdsofwildlife.org/keeper to get updates on the new film, where it'll be available, film festivals, our digital cinema event that'll be happening the end of June of 2024, and then we'll be launching it out through online platforms all across the internet. Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.